Hey, welcome. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Sandeep, and this is the first of a series of videos in which I introduce uh, and discuss the topic of psychospiritual transformative process. In this first one, I'm going to be introducing my research project that's going to take place in Austin, Texas, about psychospiritual transformation using float tanks. Where it can be framed in terms of the existing float research that's out there, and the sort of the psychological orientation that it takes, and making the case for exploring psychospiritual transformation in this particular way that I propose, using a methodology called cooperative inquiry. So this research has two objectives. Primary is transformative. We are, after all, looking into transformation and what that means for individuals and groups. So the primary goal is that the research produces a transformative outcome for the co-inquirers. The secondary research objective is to generate experiential insights that are informative about a particular domain of human experience. That while being informative, they are grounded in human experience. I want to richly describe the individual and group processes by which these insights are generated. And I'd like it to be an organic process where I'm not imposing my own theories or frames of viewing psychospiritual transformation, but honoring individual individual background and individual processes and the very personal way in which we walk through life and meeting that challenge. And participating in that challenge of transformation. I'll also talk a little bit later about how these insights are tested for validity. How do we know that individuals' propositions about their experience and it is valid? And I'd also like to urge future action. And by that I mean I would like to see float tanks being used a lot more, and I feel that there's many different applications for the float tank in psychotherapy, in education, with as a religious and contemplative tool. And one of the ways I'm working with it is in organizational development, in talent development, in conflict resolution with high performance teams. How can the float tanks practice be used within a group process where groups can meet conflict and accept and be inclusive of the conflicts that might permeate their group and turn that into creative potential? One of the theses of this project is that there's an underappreciation of float tanks generally because of its experiential nature. As we'll see, a lot of the research has taken a mechanistic approach, whereas a lot of the benefits, similar to meditation, where you meditate, then you develop a practice of meditation, then you go through very profound transformations of being, in which you're participating throughout this whole process. That is a critical component of the power of float tanks. It's unlike a medical intervention, say a pharmaceutical drug, where we can test the biophysiological markers after the intervention, because because of the experience aspect of being inside a float tank. You're in that float tank for 60 to 90 minutes, and you are doing this on some sort of regular basis for very individual, very personal, subjective reasons in which you're bringing to it. So there's an individual approach, there's an individual experience, then there's an individual meaning making that happens after the experience. That whole process is neglected in traditional research methodologies. So before float tank research existed, there was research on sensory deprivation, and you may have heard that term being applied for float tanks even now. And it still has this stigma, because you see here Donald Hebb. He was part of the Canadian, let's see, what was it called? The Human Relations and Research Committee of the Canadian Defence Research Board. Donald Hebb was a psychologist, and he's known for a lot of other things, so he's not a bad guy. But one of the things that, in the early aspects of sensory deprivation research was he found that it produced hallucinations. There was a lot of negative consequences of putting people into a dark room without any human interaction for days at a time. Doesn't seem too of a far out research conclusion to me. But they were using it, you have to think of that era. This is 1940s, 1950s, World War II, Cold War. A lot of the motivations for this research was to produce hallucinations for enemy combatants, to turn them against their own government, to interrogate spies for torture. And Hebb left this research. There was negative stigma, and he said, quote, "It scared the hell out of us to see how completely dependent the mind is on a close connection with the ordinary sensory environment, and how disorganizing to be cut off from that support." This alludes to the prevailing dogma then that consciousness is our subjective experience, and consciousness is a result of our brain and how our brain interacts with the outside world. That without it, there's catastrophic implications. There was other research that looked at essentially a lot of this research looked at physiological and behavior changes. There was one study that in 1961, several days of light deprivation produced an increase in pain sensitivity for electrically induced shock. Again, the motivations for this a little different from the later research, as we'll see. So before there was floating, there was chamber rest. And Sudfeld did a lot of research on chamber rest. And chamber rest refers to chamber reduced environmental stimulation technique. And this is different from float rest, which is the modern float tank. And essentially it's just a light-proof, soundproof room, and there were conditions to put in place to reduce tactile stimuli. John Lilly had a completely different motivation. He's interested in consciousness, and he was a radical, very profound writer. He was interested in Eastern meditation traditions. Around the time where Hebb was doing that research on chamber rest, Lilly developed the first float tank, where you were fully submerged. You had a breathing apparatus of some sort, and This was at the National Institutes of Mental Health. But Lilly was really interested in the nature of consciousness and how it changes when exposed to different environments. And you may have heard of him because those other environments included taking LSD and ketamine in the company of dolphins, as well as in the float tank. Float tank continues to have this stigma of being associated with LSD and ketamine. And I think it's useful. I'm going to talk about that in another video. I think it's useful to look into people's experiences because people are going to experiment no matter what. That is human nature. Lilly wrote a number of profound books, Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, Theory and Experiments, which was definitely influenced by his exposure to Eastern systems, such as Patanjali's yoga system. So quite different from HIP, of course. And but as we'll see, the research that started after Lilly developed the float tank moved away from the nature of consciousness and turned towards mechanisms. How can we explain some of the post-float mechanisms where people feel super relaxed, people who may have been anxious no longer anxious? There's a number of studies that have been done in US and in particular Sweden with Kjellgren and others. I won't go into all the research, but as you can see, a variety of realms that floating has been applied. Enhances in creativity, athletic performance, cognition. And there's been a number of, these aren't all of them, by the way. I'm adding to this list as we speak, but the therapeutic applications that have been looked at are numerous. But all of these studies, for the exception of phenomenological study of Kimberly Carter, recently in 2018, have a biomedical orientation and are looking at mechanisms that are inducing these post-float effects. For example, Kjellgren used quantitative data from self-report questionnaires to develop a claim that floating leads to a significant decrease in degree of depression and anxiety and an increase in positive outlook on life. These are all good things, but for from my study takes a little different perspective, and that is that, like I said, there's an experiential process. Kjellgren, in that study in 2011, they actually took qualitative data through interviews, but they didn't publish it. They mentioned that they took it, but they didn't publish it. They didn't say why or why not. But Carter in 2018 makes an important point that a lot of these post-float effects are due to the lived experience inside the tank. And I would add to that the lived experience of before the tank and after the tank, of making meaning of experiences, of making priorities, of what you're trying to work on in life. In her 2018 study, she did a phenomenological analysis, and she notes that studying flow experience requires more than just physical measures. And I think this is really important. She says, quote, "Relaxation, previously understood as physical process, goes beyond physical ailments and transcends into an area of cognitive reflection." That one's individual approach and meaning-making process is a primary indicator, and it's a primary way that it shapes the healing and transformation process itself. We'll get into that a little bit later more. The float tank let me give you some examples of the modern float tank. This is the modern float tank. It looks a lot different from scary chambers that are used for torture or John Lilly's early fully submerged. Your face is out of the water. Your whole top part of the body is out of the water. It uses a very specific amount of Epsom salt to create a buoyant environment, and the water is heated to skin temperature. Essentially, all factors are carefully designed that would affect stimulation coming from the outside world. And one of the primary aspects of float, differentiating it from the chamber rest, is that it's a float environment where that sensation of being free from gravity is quite profound and it feels great. I will mention a little bit about Feinstein's research quickly. As you can see here, this is just one float. You see great reductions in anxiety and muscle tension, increasing relaxation, increase in and measures of serenity. And Feinstein is looking at interoceptive measures with people who are anxiety sensitive. And he has some really fascinating results that in one float, people who are anxiety sensitive had a reduced anxiety, despite the fact that during the float, they had greater interoception, greater inner awareness and feeling of their heartbeat and breathing. Normally, people have high anxiety sensitivity. Once they're made aware of a heartbeat, it cascades into other things that might produce anxiety, and the immediate instinctual reaction is, how can I remove this that is causing the anxiety? So greater awareness of heartbeat and breath normally leads to greater anxiety with anxiety sensitivity people, but in the float tank, this is not the case. In one float. Excuse me. One way that floating is advertised is that you experience nothing. That it is partially true. It is carefully designed so that you're experiencing nothing from the outside world. But in that environment, it is far from nothing. As Enright alludes to here, there's a process of floating. It's like meditation. It expands perhaps our awareness of internal things and has the potential to enrich our life. And this is a profound thing. This is why many people float, yet this aspect of floating has not been studied at all. So I want to look at psychospiritual transformation. Instead of growth or improved health outcomes, I'm very specific about psychospiritual transformation because in my experience and because of the lack of this understanding in a lot of the literature out there, that the float tank is a very unique experience that defies a lot of the ways we normally would do research and understand healing. It is because it is experiential. It's an experiential process where there is a process of learning skills, of working inside you with your unconscious, gaining skills of being able to actively relax the body, areas that might feel tense despite being the floating environment. Often the case, practice floating allows you to be able to consciously relax those areas. That has been understudied. There's a lot of people doing psychological work that are doing inner child work, that are working with dreams, that are working with trauma. And this is experiential. This is something where they go through a process over time, and it's very much, to talk about it you have to actually ask these people. You have to ask them to go into their experience, and you have to develop some framework in which you can create valid, you can test their statements about their experience for validity. And this is something that the Western biomedical model, for a variety of reasons, is just not prepared to go into this type of knowledge. And for a variety of reasons, the Western biomedical model has been resistant to, one, altered states of consciousness, two, the fact that healing is associated with personal meaning making, with stories, with spirituality, which is generally avoided in the Western biomedical model, and the idea of transformation itself and having agency in that process. The Western biomedical model uses what's called clinical trial methodology, which is completely designed to eliminate any individual differences, and instead produce statistics that might be able to generalize a correlation that a particular intervention produces a particular set of results. Whereas it is really the individual differences that matter, is the claim that I'm making. Transpersonal psychology is quite appropriate as a lens to begin looking into transformative process. Not just transformative process generally as to create a system or kind of theory about it, but as into people's experiences about it, the different ways that transformation is experienced and lived out by people, the different ways they make meaning, the different cultural frames. Am I going to see transformation within a Buddhist framework? Am I going to see transformation within a Western Christian framework? Transpersonal psychology is inclusive of all these cultural and religious and spiritual ways of approaching it. Stanislav Grof is a cornerstone of the transpersonal psychology field, and he coined the term holotropic. And holotropic describes non-ordinary states of consciousness that are, quote, oriented toward wholeness, or, quote, moving in the direction towards wholeness. For Stanislav Grof, these are non-ordinary states that have vast healing potential and are marked by dramatic changes in consciousness. If you're interested, you can email me, and I can email you more of Grof's work. He's provided some very some guides, you can say, for people who may not have experience with psychology or transpersonal psychology to understand non-ordinary states of consciousness. But one of the profound things about Grof's research is that non-ordinary states, they reveal a source of information unavailable during non-ordinary states of consciousness, and that there is vast therapeutic, transformative, and evolutionary potential of these states, and that they have extraordinary effects on how we make meaning in the world, because we can be flooded with information about ourselves that we didn't know before. We can have psychological insights concerning our personal history, our unconscious dynamics, emotional difficulties, interpersonal problems. We can also experience extraordinary revelations concerning aspects of nature, of this phenomenal reality in which we're in, about our relationship with the earth, about the cosmos. That these revelations can have this quality of transcending our intellectual or educational background, and so the point I'd like to make with transpersonal psychology is that, and I'll come back around to this, is that transformative experience produces both transformation as well as insights about transformation. That transpersonal psychology is appropriate to kind of contain both the experiential aspect of transformation that will hopefully ensue from this research project, but as well as contain the insights generated and compare them and put them in a framework that where there's other theories about transformation and their meaningfulness to important areas of human life. For now, I'll just say that there's transpersonal psychology after what was called the participatory turn. This is with psychologist Jorge Ferrer, and he uses the notion of participatory to emphasize the fact that transformation, and I'll talk about it in transformative terms, but transpersonal phenomena, one's experience of them is participatory in the sense that you are participating in an event that includes other beings, and they are also participating. And it also alludes to how we can create knowledge or valid knowledge. And in the participatory turn, it's not just about individual transformation, but that individual transformation necessarily transforms the world around. And this relates to eco-psychology and depth psychology, where eco-psychology takes the perspective that the Earth, the human community, and the greater community of beings in which we are a part, and the Earth in which we are embedded, needs your transformation. Not only is your transformative process meaningful for you, but it is meaningful for the entire interconnected dynamic in which you are a part. Depth psychology emphasizes the imaginal, that transformative processes might include what you may have heard the term dark night of the soul, where there's an extended period in which you are seeking wholeness, that there is a fundamental part of the psyche, which includes you, a fundamental part of your being, that is seeking wholeness. And depth psychology is called the process of individuation. So non-ordinary states, there's some non-ordinary states that people compare floating to. They compare it to meditation, they compare it to dreaming, they compare it to psychedelic states, they compare it to the flow state. You may have heard this term flow state. And I want to maybe look at a few of these so that we might get a better sense of where we're going with the float state. There's been a lot of research on meditation. Transpersonal psychology has been instrumental in bringing a lot of Eastern techniques of meditation into Western therapeutic practice. Transpersonal psychology has also been helpful in defining what meditation can be. Here you read Walsh and Shapiro's term. And here they're attempting to create a general definition of meditation that is inclusive of the many varieties and techniques of meditation out there. So meditation similarly has psychological and transformative implications. There's been studies of how meditation affects psychological functions and behavior. MacDonald and others in 2013 importantly point out that different forms of meditation seem more effective in facilitating change in very specific areas of functioning. There's been interesting research that shows that secularized meditation that is often used in Western psychotherapeutic techniques leads to different results than meditation that is part of a religious tradition. For example, I can't remember the people who did it, but one study involving end of life palliative care, that meditation in a religious tradition was far more effective than secular sort of washed over meditations, techniques that are kind of without being clothed in religious terminology. And one of the reasons for that is that we are, from a depth psychological perspective, would take that we have a religious motivation. We seek to that is a primary aspect of being human. And researching effects and all these things, I'll keep coming back to this. It's primarily a biomedical model that they research the mechanistic aspects of a particular state and effects. Whereas this research looks at more of the process and the metaphoric aspects. Microdosing has become all the rave in recent times. And whereas research into psychedelic experiences has focused on the therapeutic aspects, such as end of life. There's been really interesting research on depression and psilocybin, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and PTSD with MAPS. But that has caused this. That has led to, among other things, interest in enhancement. Something that's known as hacking your life or consciousness hacking. And this is seen through the lens of enhancement, that we can enhance everyday function. And there's been just a couple of studies on microdosing. We haven't seen much research on that. It's different from meditation or psychedelics or flows in that it's hard to isolate a particular state of consciousness, and looks into more of the lived experience of, for example, creativity, improving mood and cognition. Similar to microdosing and enthusiasm is flow states. And this is within the realm of positive psychology. And the flow state, you might have also, it's colloquially known as being in the zone. Wikipedia calls it being in the zone. It is the mental state of operation which a person performing an activity is fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus, full involvement, and enjoyment in the process of the activity. And that's a crucial aspect. Those are all crucial aspects of the flow state. And the flow state was first described by Csikszentmihalyi. This is not the first time I'm encountering his name, but I have pretty much given up being able to pronounce his name. But he spawned a lot of research since 1975 about flow states. And it's characterized by complete absorption in what one is doing at the time. And his research looks into this relationship between that the flow state is in this very fine line between anxiety and boredom, he defines it. And it's in between this aspect of something that is really easy and something that is hard. You're just approaching, it's something that's just beyond your skill. And something about that feels really pleasurable to be engaged in. And this is some of the applications that flow has been studied is rock climbing, chess, basketball, dancing, performing surgery, performing tasks at work, physical tasks, mental tasks. In the flow state for Csikszentmihalyi, there is a merging of action and awareness. There's a loss of time awareness. There's a receding of self-consciousness. and there are features that are shared with other altered states of consciousness. But he says, quote, at the level of subjective experience, flow, like meditation, hypnosis, dreaming, and so on, takes the individual out of the normal conscious state. However, the conditions that give rise to the flow state suggest that the flow state is an optimizing of ordinary consciousness, not a turning away from it. So rather than psychedelic experience, for which Csikszentmihalyi would view that as something that is turning away from ordinary experience, he views the flow state as somehow enhancing and making pleasurable ordinary experience. While positive psychology and the flow state may seem antithetical to how transpersonal psychology views altered states of consciousness, I think that there's some shared territory that is unexplored there because of the float state. The float state, where one is not actively, physically engaged in an activity, one is inwardly engaged. And in my personal experience, the float state is a sort of flow state where you're just at the threshold of anxiety, but what you're doing feels so pleasurable in the body that you're able to approach increasing psychological challenges. I'm gonna leave that discussion for another video, but that's precisely where I see the potential of flow tanks, is that it's creating the conditions of softening some of the usual ways we might encounter difficult things like trauma or depression, anxiety, addiction. This table outlines some experiential domains of the float state. There are lots of them, and none of these have been experientially studied. On the left side are experiential domains, such as the unconscious, and the right side are all my speculative aspects of how people participate in that domain. And by participate, I mean experience, develop knowledge about, develop language to describe that knowledge, etc. For me, the most astounding aspect of the float experience is that transformation may be the result of a person being fully present and critically aware during a hypnagogic state, wherein a whole range of phenomena takes place. And moreover, the transformative process continues after the float experience, while making sense of that experience. This implies that there is opportunity to become more skilled at the float experience, as well as integrate meaning making as the float experience shapes future action. In other words, you have a float experience, you approach some challenges, which might be psychological and spiritual in nature. You gain skills to meet those challenges. After the float, you continue to immerse yourself. And when you go back into the float tank, it's another opportunity for open inquiry, where you're just a little bit more skilled in approaching maybe some of the themes that may have emerged in the previous experience. It could be totally other themes. And I'm hoping this research can tease all that out. This very multi-dimensional, multi-layered dynamic. So on that previous slide you saw, those are all my speculative aspects of how people might make meaning on these many experiential domains. So turning back to transpersonal psychology, it's informed by various conceptions of human development. There are some in transpersonal psychology that are influenced by Groff's holotropic. There's some that are influenced by Carl Jung's concept of individuation. But what a lot of these processes have in common is that there is some orientation towards wholeness, or some idea of self-actualization, as Goldstein called it. Maturana and Varela called it autopoiesis. Ken Wilber and Sri Aurobindo had various conceptions of the evolution of consciousness. And transpersonal psychology is uniquely equipped to frame transformative process, put non-ordinary states into a context that recognizes their, as Hartelius says here, that there are tokens of humanity's largely untapped potential. They're not just freak states where you might encounter random phenomena, but that they are experiential processes that individuals make meaning out of, that lead to profound transformative processes, leading towards multidimensional transformations of being. So the effects of the float tank experience that this study is going to really look at is subjective experience and agency. So it's moving from looking at acknowledging that prior studies have been mechanistic, and being inclusive of the types of knowledge that those studies can create, yet looking into this previously unexplored territory of the subjective experience. How can transformative process be known? How can it be experienced? What is the nature of our beliefs, and how do we go from belief to knowledge? This research project uses cooperative inquiry to rigorously turn beliefs into knowledge and provide a framework in which we can accurately study transformative process. Cooperative inquiry is a participative, person-centered inquiry which does research with people rather than on them or about them. In conventional human research, subjects are recruited to participate in a research process that is conceived, managed, and analyzed by the researcher. In cooperative inquiry, the roles of researcher and subject are replaced by a participative relationship. This is developed by John Heron and Peter Reason. It came out of earlier theories of action research, where the goals it had a lot of different goals from quantitative research, in that the goal for action research is transformation in communities, and it's been used in a lot of organizational development settings. Inquiry shares a lot of history with transpersonal psychology. John Heron, who was instrumental in developing cooperative inquiry, his earlier what led up to the development of cooperative inquiry was research into transpersonal phenomena. And a lot of his later cooperative inquiries, after he had established that methodology, were transpersonal in nature. So cooperative inquiry, it allows for research that explores experiential processes, and such as the float tank experience, and it invites the full range of human sensibilities as an instrument of inquiry. And it produces transformative and informative outcomes about human experience. Cooperative inquiry uses what's Heron called an extended epistemology. So conventional research has a bias towards propositional ways of knowing, meaning language about a particular domain. Whereas an extended epistemology sees a fourfold process and ways of knowing: experiential, presentational, propositional, and practical. So in this process, participants will be encouraged to probe these different ways of different ways of knowing. Experiential knowledge is the direct lived being in the world. It's the often pre-linguistic. It's before we make concepts about an experience. It's the actual experience. Presentational knowledge is an action of creative expression, such as art or dance. It's an action of symbols, imaginal symbols, of significant patterns that may be occurring within an individual or a group. Propositional knowledge, as we said, is description or explanation that is informative about an inquiry domain. And practical knowledge is the exercise of a skill. And why this is why study transformative process with cooperative inquiry? So as I alluded to earlier, the float experience has a variety of experiential aspects, such as the body, such as the unconscious, such as transpersonal phenomena that have not been explored. And in order to have these experiences, and then to know these experiences, and then to communicate these experiences, we have to have some system that tests our propositions for validity. And by acknowledging that there's different ways that we know, and that these different ways are independent yet support each other, we can create a system of feedback between experiential, presentational, propositional, and practical. So in this methodology, participants will engage in 4 phases, where in the first phase they'll reflect upon their beliefs, and we collaboratively establish the methodologies that we're going to use. And the second and third phase is an action and immersion. In the second phase, the people will be engaging in the float tank experience, and this will involve experiential knowing. In the immersion phase, they'll be looking for significant patterns and producing that, maybe in words, but also in art, in music, in dance. And this is called presentational knowing. And next, we meet as a group in the 4th phase. And this is where we'll engage in interpersonal activities to refine our knowledge and to critique individual propositions about their experience. And this presents, and this whole framework provides a within the system validity checks of is the language that we're using accurate? Does that reflect experience? So, for example, in the first phase 4, the group says float tank experience is is a psychospiritual transformative process because in the float tank, you can meet God. Let's say they say that. In the next action phase, that'll be tested. And let's say a few people come back and say, I did the action, I was totally with my experience, and I immersed myself in that. Now that we're here in our second reflection meeting, I think that proposition we made about the float tank experience is not accurate. Maybe it isn't accurate for this other person, but it's not accurate for me. Therefore, we need to engage a little bit more this topic so that we can come to more refined and valid knowledge about it. So through variations of content and method, the research cycle is repeated several times, and the 4 forms of belief, experiential, presentational, propositional, practical, metamorphose through mutual impact into 4 forms of knowledge, each interdependent with the other. This is Heron says that. I think this is really important. I've alluded to some aspects of why conventional research may not be able to appropriate for this type of study, but I will go into more critical aspects of why conventional research might fail to produce valid knowledge about psychospiritual transformation in another video. But I will say the axiological, what is the value of this research? Cooperative inquiry takes a radical stance in saying research is about human flourishing. It is not to produce some proposition about people in which they have no say in how that research came about or how it was performed and done. It is cooperative inquiry has an explicit value that it is for human flourishing. This talks about the research cycling process. Again, I think I'll talk about this in another slide. We're approaching the hour mark. So to conclude, I want to... Their research outcomes also follow this 4-fold way of knowing: experiential, presentational, propositional, practical. And I want to just review my research questions. 1. Is the experience of float tanks within a participatory research community transformative? 2. If so, how do co-inquirers describe the process of psychospiritual transformation? The secondary research questions that could arise during the cooperative inquiry process include, but are not limited to, how do co-inquirers describe the practical, experiential, and transformative outcomes of the float tank experience and of the cooperative inquiry process? What are the propositional outcomes or explanations of the transpersonal aspects of the float experience? So as discussed earlier, these research questions are designed to draw attention to a particular realm of human experience and the aspect of the experiential nature of transformative process. The secondary research questions point to the different ways of knowing and the corresponding inquiry outcomes. And I'm hoping that through this research, it'll be a dynamic process of going through experience, testing that experience, creating dynamic space for presentational knowing, looking at that significant patterns of the float experience and how it's playing out in individual lives, and then moving on to creating words and statements, propositions about psychospiritual transformative process. And this is capped off in some by practical knowledge and practical skill. One of the research outcome that kind of encapsulates the rest of the research outcomes is the practical skills that people are going to have in engaging with others to develop knowledge, and also the practical skills in action, in the action inquiry of a float tank. The practical skills that an individual might have, and the psychological dynamics. Perhaps an individual takes a more spiritual, religious view of it. Perhaps an individual takes a similar to the flow state, or with microdosing, takes an enhancement view. That is also valid in this research. So from the whole spectrum of therapeutic to enhancement effects to inclusive of transpersonal phenomena, as well as improving ordinary everyday life with our relationships with each other, with people at work. I'm hoping this research will have outcomes for all those involved.